First, I would like to present our keynote lecturer, Mathis Wackernage, professor and doctor from the Global Footprint Network in Oakland, California. He worked with Professor Rees to develop the ecological footprint concept, and he is now the president of the Global Footprint Network, which is developing and promoting metrics for sustainability. His presentation will be about economic strategy in the era of ecological overshoot. Professor Wackernage, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I hope you can hear me well. I'm in Switzerland right now on the road, so it's not the ideal connection, but it's wonderful to be with you. And Darsha, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. It's also a big birthday this weekend, 50 years after the first large UN conference on development and environment. And it's a bit of a sad birthday as well, because the progress since has been quite not too overwhelmingly positive, as you would probably say. And even, I think, from a knowledge perspective, that even though we have much more data today, the understanding of the challenges, I think, hasn't increased that much. Back then, 50 years ago, the byline of the conference was called "Only One Planet." So it seems obvious that the first principle for sustainability ultimately is that we live under a budget constraint given materially by our planet. So what I would like to talk about is to bring the conversation to the essence, and I hope you're able to see my screen to make it as simple, saying, because if we go, that's perhaps the ultimate message here I would like to share. If we bring the conversation back to the basic principles, the link between ecological deterioration or the sustainability theme and economic self-interest to act upon it is much, much stronger. I believe the most limiting factor that we face is that most people believe that we are trapped in a tragedy of the commons, meaning that, yes, we have to act as humanity, but why should I act personally, giving up my privileges to help humanity? And that's, I think, not a very helpful way to look at the situation. The self-interest to act is far stronger, and that's what I would like to show in this presentation. So the key messages that I hope will be coming through this short presentation is, first of all, that ecological overshoot, our demand exceeding what Earth can renew, is ultimately the biggest driver of environmental degradation, and it's also measurable. And perhaps the most important part is that these economic effects from overshoot are far more present than we typically believe.
Please mute yourself, who is not talking.
So the emphasis is the following: the future has never been more predictable than today, because we know that people will want to sleep and eat and drink and have a great time, etc. And at the same time, in whatever scenario we look at, there will be more climate change and there will be fewer ecological resources. If we act fast on climate change and move out of fossil fuel use, then the constraint comes also from using less fossil fuels. If we don't act fast, we may have a little bit more fossil fuel available over the short run, but we will damage much more the biological capacity on which we depend in the long run, worsening the resource constraints in the long run. So in whatever scenario, there will be more climate change and ecological resources. So the essence of that is, if we as a country, as a city, as a company are not ready for that predictable future, we as a country or individual will not be ready. We will suffer the consequences. I try to make the case there's a much stronger link. It's not just a tragedy of the commons. Your action helped you to be able to thrive in the future we can anticipate. And let me make the argument, essentially saying that we have entered a new era, the Anthropocene, where the human demand has become quite significant compared to the size of the planet. That means things have changed. The rules of the game have changed. Now, how do we know we're using more? There are a number of ways to look at, for example, planetary boundaries showing that we have exceeded capacity, but how do we operationalize that? We would say it's quite simple. Ultimately, the outcome of all these ecological conditions is regeneration. Regeneration is the most limiting factor materially for the human economy. And the various aspects like climate, biodiversity, nutrients, etc., enable that regeneration. And regeneration is measurable. It's the essence, because not only do we depend on biological assets like food, timber, and all these things, but also fossil fuel is much more limited by the size of the biosphere to absorb the waste, much more limited than what's underground. And the same is true for minerals. So by looking at the world from the lens of regeneration, we capture the drama of our time, the competition for regeneration, and can also deal with it. Now, with regeneration, I mean, obviously the photosynthesis producing biomass that becomes the food for all life and all economic supply chains. And it's linked to surfaces. Surfaces enable to regenerate. And that becomes the principle for how we can measure how much we have, how much we use. I'll go over it quite quickly, but essentially it's just looking at the world as if every country is a farm. How much farm do you have? How much farm do you use? So how much capacity, we call it biocapacity, is available, how much footprint is there. Now, the regeneration is distributed unevenly around the world. That varies by seasons, but we can look at average over the year and compare that with how much we use. So on the planet, we have about a quarter of the planet's surface that is ecologically productive. That's where most biological resources are harvested, most processes are happening. And we can bring it down to a number per person. If we divide the amount of biologically productive areas by number of people on the planet, we get about 1.6 global hectares. And these hectares obviously are not of equal productivity, so we stretch them or we squeeze them proportional to productivity. So the global hectare becomes like the currency to compare how much we have around the world. On the other hand, we can look at how much we use for our demand, and we can see that the demand now has exceeded ecological demand, ecological availability quite significantly. How is that possible? It's like with money, we can spend more money than what we earn, but we deplete the asset base. And so the ratio currently of overshoot is about 73%, and it's a minimal number because our numbers are based on UN data that are underestimating demand and overestimating regeneration. And still we can show that globally demand exceeds regeneration by 73%. At Data Footprint Network.org, you can look at more details. We're doing this work at York University. They are running these accounts now. So it's like using 1.73 Earth, but we only have one, obviously. And we can also translate that into time. If you use your budget 73 times faster than you earn your money, that means on a yearly basis, by July 29th last year, we ran out of budget. I mean, we don't run out fully of budget because we can deplete our assets. That's why we can continue to drink beer and eat bread after that date, but it's at the cost of depletion. What are the economic implications? That's where I would like to spend kind of the main argument on, and then we can have a conversation. Essentially, we can break it down from a global basis to a local basis. Let's look at every country like a farm, as I said, and say to what extent is their demand larger than what their own ecosystems can renew. What we published last year is we showed that 72% of the world population lives now in a country that both has an ecological deficit, so they use more than what their ecosystems can renew, and they have less than world average income. That means they don't have the purchasing power to bring the extra resources to their country over the markets. So they're in a very tough double bind, 72% of the world population. So resource security clearly is becoming a key driver for the long-term ability of these countries to succeed, and puts enormous tension on them. That leads also to the so-called Pinker paradox. Steven Pinker claims that things have becoming much better over the last decades, and in many domains that it's true. Longevity, for example, is expanding. Incomes have decreased. There's still poverty around, etc. But there are many social factors that have improved. There's now more wars and then the pandemic, etc. But at the same time, we're also using more and more resources. So how do we resolve that paradox? We're doing it through looking at the two dimensions of sustainable development, saying, yes, we want human development. That's on the horizontal axis. We want to have higher and higher human development. At the same time, we also need to look at how many resources would it take. So we measure that in terms of how many Earth would be necessary if everybody lived at that level. And then also remember, we may not want to use the entire Earth because there are other species as well. So we can make a dot for every person in the world. Here you can see the dot for every country in the world. And then there's this little quadrant of where would we ideally, it's not just ideally, where we need to be to, we want to have high quality of life, and we need to use less than one Earth regeneration capacity. So the tragedy is right now that our development moves us along the red arrow. And even the SDGs, we did a paper on that, even the SDGs are still driving the red arrow in this direction. What we do need is the green arrow. It's helping us move in this direction. And this has direct economic implications. We work with a number of investors, but also with companies that recognize, companies that are able to move their clients in the direction of the box will have a far higher chance to be around in the long run. To say it in a different way, if you have a company and if you double the company, global overshoot would go down. These companies are in a very strong position because they're able to sell goods and services that are needed. And they also do it in a way that reduces resource demand. So the likelihood of them being able to operate in the predictable future is very high. So it shows that the link between business strategy and sustainability principles is far stronger than we believe. Let me look at it from another perspective.
I'm sorry, Mathis, there's a lot of noise. I think it's in the background from where you're speaking. Is it possible? I don't know if you speak louder or bring microphone closer to your mouth.
Can you hear better now? Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah, I hope so.
Maybe it's the problem, the room where are you sitting? It looks like in cafe or something.
It is the problem to have access to. I'm traveling right now, and so that's why.
Yeah, we will survive. You just talk further.
Okay,
it's fine.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Don't worry. just do it.
I speak louder. I speak louder.
Thanks.
So I think the next point is, from an economic perspective, to recognize that the situation is not our burden. So it's not just a moral obligation. It's actually our context in which we can make our decisions. If we think of it from that perspective, we start to realize that knowing more about our context helps us make better decisions. So what does that mean specifically? If we look at the past, human demand against what's available, this is over my lifetime, human demand has increased, and actually it's the pink area that represents the debt that we have accumulated ecologically over time. That's draining the biosphere overall. And the question is, how will it continue? Many people think, oh my goodness, let's just continue how it was in the past. Everything was fine. But the level of debt that we already have accumulated has led to such a high concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, deforestation, loss of fisheries, etc., that it's unlikely that we can increase the ecological debt to that extent. We could also follow the IPCC scenario, that's called the 1.5 degrees scenario, that moves down, and still we would increase the debt. So even under this scenario, we would have more climate change and obviously also more resource constraints. So the point is, we don't know exactly how the track will be, but what we do know is that investments that we make today have a very long lifespan compared to that movement. And that's not necessarily negative, it just means it's a long time span. So what we build today, the question is, will this asset be able to operate in the future we can anticipate? If it does, it will be much more valuable. If it doesn't, it becomes a liability, or some people call it stranded assets. And this has two major implications. One is we will lose value. Obviously, that's bad, not just for the investor, but also for society, because these assets will not be able to perform for the benefit of society. The second implication may be even worse. It's not just that we lose value, but we will lose value at the time when the economy is frail. Assets are needed to support us, particularly through difficult times. And if they fail at the time where we need them most, it becomes additionally risky. So the way forward is one planet prosperity, saying the only alternative to one planet prosperity is one planet misery. So it's an easy choice to say, yeah, let's move towards one planet prosperity. How can we actually address this while making sure we thrive? That's why we started an initiative called Power of Possibility, to empathize how many possibilities exist already today to reduce resource demand while also producing economic viability. I just will show two. You can go to our website, Power of Possibility, and there are many there. One of them is a financial example, a bank that said, rather than using our money for general investments, we'll use our money from your deposits to invest in the ecological energy transition. We invest in solar power and private and commercial solar power. What we calculate is that with every dollar you put in a bank account, on average, the footprint of the United States would go up. But if you deposit it in a bank that uses its investments to pay for the transition or to invest in a transition towards green energy, then you actually help reduce the footprint of the US. So it makes a big difference. So you can say the more you have banks like Atmos, the better the world is off. Another example is just kind of say, what's the potential for bicycle infrastructure improving, thereby displacing car transportation and public transportation? We did rough estimates of how much can be displaced worldwide by moving current car transportation to bicycles. We came to the conclusion that Earth Overshoot Day, just for that alone, could be moved 9 days just through better bicycle infrastructure. And that's just one example. So we're translating all these possibilities in ways, how much would we actually gain in terms of budget? And does it add up to being able to have a one planet prosperous future? So let me summarize these ideas here. Oops. The key implications economically are the following I try to emphasize, and there are many more obviously, but one is knowledge about overshoot is not a burden. It gives us context to better understand which investments will be viable and which ones are not. We are in such significant overshoot, and we can also see that the market has not reacted to that overshoot. So disruption will be much more likely because the market is not adjusting the prices. And so that makes prevention even more important to country, because shocks are far more difficult to deal with than gradual market shifts. That's why the core question for us is, when we look at investment, when we look at companies, if a company doubles, as an example, would global overshoot go up or down? And that helps us to identify which assets, whether it's city infrastructure or your personal investment portfolio, which infrastructures will be fit for the predictable future, because those will gain relatively to other assets in value. And these are not just fringe examples. There are plenty of examples how it's possible to move the date while also building economic viability. It's not a trade-off. Actually, if you want to create lasting value, this is the only path forward. With that, I hope I covered the three messages that I believe really at the core of everything is ecological overshoot. Our metabolism having become too large compared to what ecosystems can renew, that brings all these issues together. And by addressing it, actually we address most of the ecological challenges. it's measurable, so we can manage it. And also economically, it makes absolute sense. Not to prepare yourself for the predictable future is economic insanity. So the economic reality is already there. The perception that it's in our self-interest to act still hasn't won. And that's why conferences like ours are so important. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. This is a very interesting and very important measure how we are advancing. I would like to ask you, how do you estimate the present situation? Because, you know, if we look for the reports, IPCC or the European Environmental Agency, then we see that we are going not according to the Paris or the other agreements. And I have very good experience with my students. They have to calculate the ecological and the carbon footprints, and they react, but not enough. They are not able to come down to 1.7. I don't have experience how it is in companies or in states. Do they calculate the footprint? Do they act on the basis of the results?
I think the tricky part is that people see the results as a limitation of their lives rather than enabling a better future for themselves. And that's why we have the footprint calculator, but I'm pedagogically not totally sure if it's that net positive. I think we have one of the best calculators out there because we try to make it pedagogically interesting, but I think it starts more from helping to understand, why do I personally have skin in the game? Why does it matter for my life? And so, because from a logical perspective, clearly we have to reduce the metabolism, but that's not inviting to people. That's why many government agencies are afraid of the message, because they think it's becoming an impossible task. This is why we have translated the message, not to say let's not reduce the footprint, but we say actually we have to increase resource security. Because if you increase resource security, you start to recognize you're investing in yourself. If Slovenia increased its resource security, for example, it invests in Slovenia's ability to operate well in the future. It's not just a gift to the world that vanishes into the ocean of the world. It actually invests into yourself. And so I think people start to recognize that true effective sustainability action is the most effective thing for you yourself to have a safe future.
May I add something? I agree totally with you. And IRDO is 18 years now old. This is Inštitut where I am coming from. And we started with raising awareness on the topic of social responsibility and sustainability. And we found out that there is really important theory of change. There are many obstacles because of our habits. We do not want to change. And raising awareness through campaigns like yours and work like yours is very important for each individual, because we as individuals are members of the bigger society, and then the society can change if we change.
And I think the more important language to use is actually to start from the country level, because people think about countries. As I said, countries are like farms. And for Switzerland, for example, where I'm from, Switzerland uses 4.5 times more than Switzerland can regenerate. And I think the first step is to recognize, is that a risk for Switzerland or not? If Switzerland doesn't see it economically as a risk, it's going to be very difficult to lead to meaningful actions. I think that's where the hope really is. Is this enormous resource insecurity of Switzerland a major parameter of its future risks? I think yes. But that's where we haven't won the argument yet. And I think it's too much kind of because people think, oh my God, it's too much of a burden. It's taking privileges away. We think it's an argument to help Switzerland to be strong. We're not taking away anything from Switzerland by recognizing resource security as a key parameter.
Thank you very much. Would someone else like to comment, Peter or Nomi or?
Let's move it to the discussion section. Will you be able to be with us? This is at 11 and 10.
I'm not sure because Mr. is traveling. Mr. Mathis. We don't hear.
Unmute yourself, please.
Yeah. I'm around for another hour. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. The next presentation will be.
Just a moment, Peter. Just
a second. I will share with everyone links to publications on the also the agency website and also one video by Global Footprint Network. So just for additional information. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Mr. Matthias, may I just add something? Yesterday we have heard from students from University of Maribor something. Maybe you and they could connect. Nomi, can you present shortly? Just 1 minute you have.
Hi, also from my side. My name is Nomi. I come from the University of Maribor. I'm currently a student at the Faculty of Economics and Business. And as part of our project that we did with the Faculty of Logistics, we created a study and the analysis of if it is needed to have an application that could, a mobile app that could actually help you plan your transport, or your personal, mostly personal, and also for companies to plan your transport route, and also according to that, to tell you which of the routes is more eco-friendly and would have less emissions and would have less carbon footprint. So then the different students actually created this app with our analysis, and the app is now working, but it's in Slovenian. It's a lot of work, but the point is to present how much carbon footprint does somebody have or create with just using the personal transport routes and so on, and different types of vehicles. So
that's awesome. When you buy a ticket in France out of the machine, half of the ticket is about carbon implications. How much carbon does it take for this trip, and how much would it take by car? So that's on the ticket already. Half the size of the ticket is only about that.
Perfect.
Slovenia is really behind all of that. That's amazing. Thank you.
So you can use it, yeah? Okay, some other urgent question? I don't see all of you, so just speak up.
Yes, I would like to add that we can make a change in the program. So since Mathis is with us only for another hour, we can ask some more questions. My issue of interest is how to connect your findings with policies of individual countries or unions across the world. Or maybe if you can talk about the United States, which you know better. Yes.
I wish I had an answer. I mean, one of the tragedies we're in is that I would call it like the tragic mind frame that most people are in is what could be called inconvenient truth. That sounds very interesting, inconvenient truth. But what people hear is that the more they know about the issues, the more they have a burden. And so it represents a disincentive to understand. They used to say of the oil industry, I don't know if it's a bit rude to say, but it's to say, if your salary depends on not understanding, it's very, very difficult to understand. And so I think that's kind of the mind frame that we say it's a moral burden to understand. And most people here, I have to give up my own privileges. The more I know, the more I limit myself. I'm emphasizing this point because I think that's really the root cause that limits meaningful policy discussions. If you look at the other end, I mean, the SDGs in some ways, hooray that they exist and they're so pluralistic, it's everything there. But as a whole, we just did a paper, they're still negatively correlated with environmental sustainability. And there's so much in there that anybody can say, oh yeah, we contribute to the SDGs, as if it was just a moral burden to kind of contribute somehow to something obscure. That's why I think we need to get much stronger in putting the resource security aspect front and center. It's now gaining some more traction with the Ukraine war because it becomes obvious how fragile we are from a resource perspective, and it's still marginal. So that's one of the big disappointments, I think, in my professional life. We started more from the policy side early on and realized that just a basic understanding of overshoot and resource constraints is lacking at all levels. And that's why we have focused far more on making this understanding accessible. If you do media search on the word overshoot, which is the underlying thing, last year there were 400 articles about overshoot in the media. There were 10,000 about Earth Overshoot Day, which is just an example. There were 50,000 articles about SDGs, which are just trying to react to overshoot, but actually don't yet. And there were 3 million about climate change, which is just one symptom of overshoot. So I think our understanding of the metabolism of the human economy is still far too weak to help push policies in the right directions. I think it's still as separate as the environment ministry, and then there's actually the economic ministry. Now with the Green Deal, there's more conversation around it, but still the pushback is enormous. So I think there has to be a much stronger sense of that connection, and we have to break the belief that we're stuck in an inconvenient truth. It's convenient to understand the context we live in. That's what we need to say.
I think that some laws have to be accepted, otherwise it will not work. Some other question, please.
I actually went through all the solutions, the 100 solutions on the website Move the Date, and I found many of them applicable in Slovenia too, in European Union. Do you have any feedback about impact of these solutions of this website?
I just put the link in. We just started it last year, just after Overshoot Day. It tries to feed into a psychology, and I think that has been positive, that obviously overshoot has a shock value, but in the end, people have to feel a sense of abundance, of plenty, that they feel open. If there is a sense of scarcity, they shrink and become fearful. Now, the big trick psychologically, and we are all kind of in pedagogical fields, is how do we generate a sense of psychological abundance in a situation of ecological scarcity. And I think that's the idea of power of possibility, to give people a sense, oh my goodness, there's so much possible. I can be part of it, rather than get into a fear state and say, oh, we cannot do anything. Because we can turn things around. Overshoot is not the biggest risk. The biggest risk is to stay blind to overshoot. I'm not Malthusian at all. If we don't address this issue, the world becomes Malthusian. But we can circumnavigate the Malthusian trap if we pay attention. The problem is paying attention, not overshoot.